This literature review was undertaken at the request of Ontario's Changing Workplaces Review in 2016, and it was meant to inform the Commission's review of employment standards enforcement based on the literature, not only with respect to labor standards, but with respect to analogous regulatory frameworks, and to draw out of that options for consideration that the Commission might think about further. So the review focused on a couple of different themes. One was access to justice, or the accessibility of enforcement mechanisms. And the other was effectiveness of enforcement and compliance. And those are not, of course, the same things. It's well known that people whose rights are violated don't always complain about it, and that complaints only often represent the tip of the iceberg in terms of the overall compliance picture. In terms of access, what the literature demonstrates is that many workers, especially those who are most vulnerable to low pay and precarious working conditions, likely face barriers to access. And first among those is well-founded fears of employer reprisal. But also included in those barriers are direct and opportunity costs of the claims process, difficulties in presenting and documenting claims, and lack of access to professional advice and representation. So among the options that the report recommended were providing stronger remedies for in the anti-reprisal provisions of the Act, free advice to workers on how to file and pursue a claim, enabling workers to recover some of the costs associated with pursuing a claim, and enabling class actions to pursue claims for amounts owing as a result of violations of the Act as a kind of parallel means of enforcement to supplement the direct enforcement by the ministry. In terms of effective systems for compliance and enforcement, and I have to say this is probably where 2/3 of the report's attention lies, because I think it's probably the more important of the two sets of issues, is the report begins by kind of outlining the context in which we're operating. Ontario has seen a growth in the vulnerable workforce. Just as in the United States, there's been a fissuring of the Ontario production systems in many sectors of the economy. And these pose very difficult challenges for the effectiveness of enforcement, and particularly for a complaint-driven enforcement approach, which is the current approach, though there was a step up in proactive enforcement following the Changing Workplaces Review's report. It's still largely complaint-driven. The literature suggests that attending to these changes in the structure of the economy requires three things: a strategically targeted and proactive system of inspection, deterrence of deliberate or recurrent non-compliance, and strategies for networked industries that are aimed at root causes of non-compliance. The literature, I think, both in labor standards and in other fields like environmental standards, suggests that, roughly speaking, you can group in this case, we're talking about employers, the regulated entities, into three. It's probably.
Okay. Sorry, I was writing to Leah to see if she was coming. Okay, good.
It's probably fair to say that any strategy for effective compliance and enforcement, if it's going to be efficient as well, needs to take account of the existence of these three groups. And roughly speaking, the first group of employers are employers whose business strategies don't conflict with employment standards enforcement. They're already providing standards equivalent to what's there in the Act to their employees, and they have very little interest in not doing so. And so, most often if there's non-compliance within this group, it's due to inadvertence or lack of information. A second group is a group whose incentives are a little more mixed. But because they have incentives running in both directions, and they likely inhabit a normative universe in which compliance still has some value. And so when you look at the literature and the research on the level of compliance, the risk that you're going to be sanctioned is not enough to account for the amount of compliance within industry. And this suggests, and there's good research showing that the normative framework in which the industry operates matters, that managers, those who control businesses, take those norms into account. And you can leverage that normative framework to improve compliance with another subset of the population. And then thirdly, there's a group who are persistently incentivized to break the law because their business models are marginally profitable, because they're operating in highly competitive sectors, and because they depend on low cost and high turnover labor. And within that subsector of the population, you'll often find a kind of degraded or alternative normative framework in which non-compliance is not treated as a big deal. So, given the limited resources of any enforcement branch of the ministry, it's important to take into account these three groups and target resources accordingly. So for the first set of employers, an effective compliance strategy would entail mainly the dissemination of clear information, both to employers and employees, on compliance in many languages, and making it accessible. For the second group, compliance may impose moderate administrative costs and burdens, but you can leverage that sense of normative duty. So what you need to do is establish a consistent and fair and perceived to be fair approach to enforcement. And this, I think, involves about 4 elements. You want to enlist the support of respected industry and professional human resource associations. You want to use an approach to enforcement that avoids an appearance of unreasonableness that might arise by sanctioning technical violations or stigmatizing unintentional violations. But conversely, you need to use an approach to enforcement that visibly and firmly deals with deliberate non-compliance, so as to provide reminders and reassurance to the community of regulated employers that the government takes the rules seriously and intends to provide a level playing field. Fourthly, you need to use an approach to enforcement that publicizes findings of deliberate non-compliance in order to provide reassurance and reminders to compliant members of the community, and to provide appropriate incentives to those who are not complying. And then lastly, and this is, I think, where probably most of the energy needs to be devoted in order to deal with the third group, the persistent non-compliers, need reliable detection of violations, predictable imposition of monetary remedies and sanctions with significant deterrent value, and problem-solving approaches that seek to relieve, where possible, some of the competitive pressures that lie at the roots of systemic non-compliance. And this would typically mean working where it's possible to do so with lead firms, for example, in supply chains, to correct some of the systemic problems. Now, the strategies for the second and third group are interdependent. Norms need to be reinforced by effective enforcement. So the report goes on to propose 7 principles of good practice that emerge from the literature, and strategies to implement each of those principles. And I won't go into the full set of details, but I'll just outline the principles and some of the key elements of the strategy, and then talk about some of the challenging issues that are involved in implementing a coherent approach. So principle number 1, Information on what compliance requires should be readily available and proactively disseminated to employers and employees. I think that's fairly straightforward. The second one, non-compliance should be detected and targeted proactively and strategically. And I think here, what's involved is a kind of paradigm shift or approach. Yeah, I think it's a paradigm shift for what ministry inspectorates are about. They need to shift from seeing themselves as primarily involved in complaints handling and meeting service standards with respect to complaints, and towards more of a kind of policing function, where their job is along a community policing model, where they need to know what's going on in the community and they need to be responsible for promoting compliance within the community. So this involves strategically targeted proactive inspections along the lines that David Weil has written about. It means that the inspectorate needs to regularly collect and analyze statistical survey data on compliance. It means that it needs to be in dialogue with community worker and community associations who are involved in representing workers. It needs to analyze incoming and processed complaints data in order to proactively focus their compliance and enforcement initiatives. They need to treat evidence of deliberate non-compliance that's uncovered in the course of a complaint investigation as prima facie warranting an extension of the investigation. They need to collect data during investigations about industry structures, such as common employers, management structures, franchising and ownership structures, so that they can trace the relationships between employers within the community. And they need to develop the capacity to link quickly to other sources of government data that may indicate a propensity towards non-compliance. And this might include, for example, tax data. So the third principle is that voluntary compliance approaches should be preferred in dealing with non-deliberate non-compliance, or where the employer is willing to commit to credible and enforceable undertakings to eliminate deliberate non-compliance. Again, this is a matter of efficiency and getting out in front of problems. Fourth, deliberate and persistent non-compliance should face deterrent remedies and sanctions. And there are different options here, but among them is providing clear policy direction to the inspectorate that deterrent sanctions and remedies should normally be imposed where an inspector believes that the non-compliance is deliberate. There should be an increase in the value and frequency of sanctions to deter deliberate or repeat violations. There should be regular investigations in the course of inspections of whether or not the non-compliance is intentional. It matters to the overall strategy of compliance and enforcement. And there should be an increased willingness to prosecute egregious violations of the Act. So those are some of the options for consideration under that particular principle. Fifth, enforcement methods should include tools and strategies addressing systemic and root causes in sectors where non-compliance is pervasive. And so here, one prominent aspect of implementing that principle might be, at least where lead firms are vulnerable on a reputational level, to begin working with them to address the way that their supply chains are structured, for example, or their franchising operations work. Six, enlist complementary state and non-state regulatory systems. So here, for example, there's a fairly large literature on using procurement policy as a way to reinforce compliance incentives. And then seventh, and this probably should have been first, but this is where it came out in the report, was be prepared to consider increasing resources. The basic message here um, emerges from the context. We have most of the workers who are most vulnerable are not represented by trade unions, and there isn't a prospect in the near future, at least, that they're going to be. The hope, I think, that underpinned the division of labor between employment standards and labor relations law in the 1950s and 60s, when these systems were set up, was that eventually unionization would become more available, but it hasn't. And I think we need to recognize that to protect this group of workers, the state is going to have to step up. And that requires, will almost certainly require more resources. There are four, I found at least four, but here are four challenging issues embedded in this set of options for experimentation. The first is with respect to access to justice. When do you allow workers to settle their own claims? This is a difficult question. Often workers are incentivized, but sometimes for the wrong reasons, to settle their claims. They're desperate for the money. There's been delay, and yet, do you take away the ability of someone to carry their own case in order to promote the overall objectives of compliance and enforcement of the system? That's a tough choice. Second, there are trade-offs between allowing anonymous claims and pursuing the objective of strategic enforcement. One of the I think more difficult debates in the course of this review is, should we empower anonymous complainants to trigger the inspection mechanism automatically, or at the moment the ministry just is willing to receive information anonymously and may take it into account in deciding whether to inspect, but it doesn't automatically trigger an inspection. Now, you might say, well, that disincentivizes people from anonymously bringing information forward, and that's probably true. On the other hand, if resources are scarce and the ministry is going to implement a strategic approach to inspections, allowing anonymous complaints to automatically divert resources towards that particular complaint isn't really consistent necessarily with the strategy. The third tough issue is how to implement deterrence. And here there's a choice that could be made between kind of a wholesale application of more deterrent remedies, through administrative monetary penalties, for example, or a selective use of high-profile prosecutions that involve bigger sanctions and greater stigma. And these are different choices about the allocations of resources. The tough part comes in that it arises out of the fact that either way, you probably need to have some sort of an adjudication or appeal process in order to make it procedurally fair. And so I have a personal preference for the wholesale approach. I think, my inclination would be to use deterrent sanctions often, whenever you detect deliberate non-compliance. But that means a wholesale process for handling appeals as well. And, others, I think the commissioners who wrote the report felt that it would be more efficient to use prosecutions because that would involve less legal proceedings and then just, publicize the results of these higher profile proceedings as a way of maximizing deterrence. And then finally, resource allocation. There are some tough choices probably that have to be made as between complaints handling and proactive inspections. And the commissioners, the advisors to the minister in the end said, we recommend that you tell workers that not all of their complaints are going to be handled. You provide another way for those complaints to be dealt with because you need to reassign resources to proactive inspection. And so that means that in some cases, the worker will be on their own or, with whatever representation they can secure. So I'll stop there. hopefully that gives you something to think about in a framework for to consider the cases.